I'm Elektra Papadopoulos, Acting Deputy Director and Scientific Coordinator for the Clinical Outcome Assessment Qualification Program, and it is my pleasure and honor to kick off this first session of the 12th Annual PRO Consortium Workshop alongside my FDA colleagues with some FDA updates. And of course, the views we will be discussing this morning are those of the speakers and not necessarily an FDA position. We have a great agenda lined up this morning. We're very fortunate to have David Reisner, who just came aboard as the Division of Clinical Outcome Assessment Director in January, give some opening remarks. Next, I'll provide updates from the COA Qualification Program, as well as some key COA-related guidance updates. Following that, Robyn Bent from CDER's Office of the Director will discuss the CDER Pilot Grant Program for standard core COAs and their related endpoints, and we'll close with a panel discussion, including questions and answers. Before diving into the presentations, I'd like for each of my fellow panelists to introduce themselves, and I will start with Robyn.
Hello, my name is Robyn Bent. I am the Director of Patient-Focused Drug Development in the Office of the Center Director, and I'm also a CDER, and I'm also the Program Officer for the Standard Clinical Outcome Assessment Grant Program, and so I look forward to speaking to you a little bit later today. Thank you. Let me turn it over to Michelle.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle Campbell, and I lead stakeholder engagement and clinical outcomes for the Office of Neuroscience, and I will be moderating our panel discussion and question and answer session for this session today. Laura Lee.
Hi, I am Laura Lee Johnson, and I am one of the directors in the Office of Biostatistics in CDER, and we also oversee all of the patient-focused drug development work inside of the Office of Biostatistics and the Office of Translational Sciences. So I guess we'll skip to David since Elektra is kicking us off.
David, I believe you were on mute. All right, so I will now turn the presentation over to David Reisner.
Okay, thanks everyone. I did say hello. Good morning. I'm David Reisner, Director, Division of Clinical Outcome Assessment, and looking forward to being here today for my first time from the other side of the table. So thank you, Elektra, and thank you to the attendees at this, our 12th Annual PRO Consortium. Today we'll hear more about ongoing activities and initiatives that aim to develop new tools within particular therapeutic areas, as well as across areas for concepts in common. But first, I'd like to share a current snapshot of the division and a little update on where we sit within the organization. There we go, a little technical delay as we transition the ball. So as you can see, this is a brief outline of our current staffing with Elektra and I in leadership roles. Selena Daniels, and 2 open team leader roles. We have 3 regulatory project managers and 12 reviewers covering various review divisions, clinical review divisions, organized currently in 3 teams, as well as a project specialist. As to where we sit within the organization, many of you are aware there have been ongoing reorganizations within the agency. DCOA, Division of Clinical Outcome Assessment, DCOA sits within the Office of New Drugs and a newly formed Office of Drug Evaluation Sciences, ODES, led by Dr. Jeffrey Siegel. Other notable changes within the organization of O&D include an expansion in the number of clinical review divisions from 19 to 27, overseen by 8 clinical offices, the creation of 6 non-clinical review divisions, that is Pharm Tox, and the creation of cross-functional support offices such as ODES and New Drug Policy. So as you can see, the complexity of our mission in terms of supporting clinical review divisions has increased, but so has the focus within each of those review divisions as we collaborate and interact with them. Lastly, it is worth commenting on the benefit of the PRO Consortium as a pre-competitive private-public partnership to advance the measurement of concepts that are important to patients. The PRO Consortium, in its many roles, as a forum for discussion like today, as a requester in our DDT program, is a significant aspect of DCOA's mission. And that concludes my comments.
Thank you, David. All right, so over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be providing a programmatic update for our COA qualification program and other updates of interest. Last November, CDER published final guidance describing the qualification process for drug development tools, including COAs, biomarkers, and animal models, among others. The guidance describes process under the 21st Century Cures Act. As many in this audience know, there is a 3-stage qualification process for DDTs. The process is initiated with a letter of intent. The next stage is the qualification plan stage, akin to an end of phase 2 milestone in drug development. And finally is the full qualification package, which is reviewed for qualification determination. Now, in between these stages, we can also receive updates and meeting requests. An update is any submission that's not a milestone submission, such as a qualitative study protocol for review and input. Now, I want to also take a few minutes here to stress that there are content outlines for each of these stages posted on our webpage. And each milestone submission should be a standalone submission, meaning it's a self-contained submission with everything that is needed for our review and without the need for any additional materials. So each of the milestones has a target review clock as shown in this table. We conduct a reviewability assessment at each milestone, which results in a letter issued to the requester with the reviewability determination. Note that the review clock begins when the reviewable memo is issued. Now, having reviewed the process under 21st Century Cures, I'll now turn to some qualification program metrics. First, I'm thrilled to report that there were 2 qualifications last year. In April, CDER issued a qualification statement for several key domains of an existing PRO measure, the Kansas City Cardiomyopathy Questionnaire, specifically the total symptom score, the physical limitation score, and the clinical summary score, which is the composite of the first two. The second qualification determination, of course, occurred in December and was for the Diary for Irritable Bowel Syndrome symptoms, constipation, or DIB-C. And each of these qualification statements with specifics on their qualified context of use can be found on our qualification webpage. So I just want to really take a minute to congratulate everyone involved, especially the FDA review teams who really spent many hours with these packages and diligently reviewing the data, as well as the developers who also diligently put together the packages, particularly our colleagues at the PRO Consortium. Now, these qualification determinations were, of course, the big news, but we were also busy with qualification review at all stages. From January of 2020 till March 18th of this year, we accepted 11 letters of intent, bringing the total number of active qualification projects currently to 60. When we look at the qualification projects by therapeutic area, we see a nice spread across a variety of therapeutic areas. The areas with the highest numbers currently are GI and neurology, with 8 projects each. When we look at the breakdown by COA type, we see that PRO measures dominate, with a total of 37 projects. All types, though, are represented here in this table. In terms of trends over time, as you can see, we've seen a steady increase in letters of intent, qualification submissions, and meeting requests. This includes 2 new full qualification package submissions to our program last year. We are also very pleased to announce that there were 6 DDT research grants awarded in fiscal year 2020, and these grants are to support developers of drug development tools that have an already accepted letter of intent within the DDT qualification program and who are working towards the next qualification milestone submission. For FY21, we currently have a funding opportunity announcement out with a due date in May 25th. For these and other updates, including newly qualified COAs, updates to our resources, and process changes, we encourage anyone to sign up for the COA Qualification Program email listserv, and the URL is at the bottom of this slide. So I'd now like to transition to some guidance and other updates. In addition to the qualification process guidance, 2020 also saw several other important guidance. Let me start with a high-level overview of the patient-focused drug development guidance series and provide a brief status update. So this is a series of 4 guidance documents. Guidance 1 is titled Collecting Comprehensive and Representative Input, and it covers identifying research questions and developing a sampling strategy for eliciting patient input. This guidance was finalized last June. Guidance 2 is titled Methods to Identify What is Important to Patients, and it covers methods to elicit detailed and unbiased and comprehensive input from patients, patient groups, and caregivers through non-leading questions that are well understood by a wide range of patients. This guidance was issued in draft in the fall of 2019 and is now in the late stages of finalization for publication. Guidance 3 is titled Selecting, Developing, or Modifying Fit-for-Purpose Clinical Outcome Assessments and is currently being drafted. This guidance, once final, will replace the 2009 PRO guidance for industry and will cover not only PRO measures, but COAs more broadly. Finally, Guidance 4, titled Incorporating COAs into Endpoints for Regulatory Decision-Making, addresses the steps following the development or selection of the COA, including developing COA-related clinical trial endpoints and interpreting those endpoints. This guidance is also being drafted. This information and more, including completed workshops and discussion documents, can be found on the FDA PSDD webpage. Of course, 2020 was a year unlike any other as the world responded to the COVID-19 public health emergency. Tele-COA-related endpoint questions sprouted from the need for our sponsors to quickly adapt their trials. In response, FDA updated the guidance for industry, conduct of clinical trials of medical products during the COVID-19 public health emergency. This update included factors both general across all COA types, as well as those specific to individual COA types that sponsors should consider when deciding whether to change the clinical trial protocol during the public health emergency to include remote clinical outcome assessment. Examples of the considerations include first, feasibility of remote assessment, the availability of technology and technical support, the potential for increased data variability, patient privacy considerations, documentation, and others. Concurrently, the PRO Consortium was also developing a set of points to consider regarding adapting from in-clinic PRO assessment to remote PRO assessment. And both of these efforts serve to complement each other. Now, with the influx of COVID-related INDs, also came the need for guidance on measurement of symptoms in outpatients with acute COVID-19. We knew in the acute setting we would need daily assessment. The struggle was with a large number of heterogeneous symptoms in patients with COVID-19. Ultimately, we recommended assessing a core set of 14 symptoms that were based on information from the CDC webpage. And we did this to decrease the patient burden and risk of missing data that can result from lengthy daily reports. We opted for verbal rating scales for ease of interpretation. We also recommended a time to event endpoint for sustained clinical recovery using scores derived from each symptom instead of a total score, while leaving latitude for sponsors to develop specific definitions during their drug development programs. And for these and other COVID-19 related guidance, please check the website for the most current versions. Last but not least, we anticipate soon publishing the second update to the COA compendium since the launch of the pilot in January of 2016. Many in this audience may recall that the compendium tabulates by indication COAs that have been previously labeled and may serve as a starting point for consideration and discussion between drug developers and the FDA. It also includes COAs that have been qualified through the DDT Qualification Program. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I will now turn the presentation to Robyn Bent.
Great, thanks so much, Elektra. Let me just get technologically set up. All right, great, thank you. So thanks so much for having me today. I'm really excited to join you and talk a little bit about our Standard Core Clinical Outcome Assessment and Related Endpoints grant program. This grant program really grew out of our patient-focused drug development efforts and things that we were hearing at our patient-focused drug development meetings. So in addition to hearing about the impact of diseases or conditions on patients' daily lives and also the burden of those conditions and potentially the treatments they were using to treat the conditions in order to help inform our FDA benefit risk assessments, we also heard from patients that clinical trials aren't always measuring the things that matter most to them. And so we wanted to kind of help address that. And as you know, including clinical outcome assessment measures developed with input from patients into clinical trials is a great way to make the incorporation of the patient voice more sustainable. But as our patient-focused drug development efforts began maturing, we noticed that at the time there was little coordination in the efforts to develop clinical outcome assessments, including within a given disease area. That there is a duplication of efforts and sometimes a diversity of measures, and that some of the tools being developed were proprietary. In addition, kind of FDA reviewers currently receive multiple independent clinical outcome assessments for review, each of which takes time to understand and evaluate. And we see a variable quality of the tools and the resulting data that may limit the tool's utility for regulatory decision-making. And so the purpose of the Standard Coracoa grant program really is threefold. One, it aims to make the incorporation of patient perspective more sustainable. It aims to enable the development of publicly available standard core sets of measures of disease burden and treatment burden for a given area. And it provides avenues to advance the use of patient input as an important part of drug development. And while we're all aware that core sets can include items other than clinical outcome assessments and that not all clinical outcome assessments measure things that are important to patients, CDER chose to focus on core sets of clinical outcome assessments because that's where we were seeing or having the greatest struggles from a methodologic standpoint, and also because COA development is such a resource-intense process. And so for our purposes, within the program, a standard core set can include different types of clinical outcome assessments and their related endpoints that assess a minimum list of impacts that matter most to patients, are likely to demonstrate change, including differences in trial arms related to disease burden, treatment burden, and if applicable, physical function, and should be reported in a clinical trial. And as part of the program, FDA expects grantees to conduct a well-managed, transparent, and methodologically sound process that provides for consistent application of appropriate methods, and that would include the PFDD guidance documents that Elektra referenced earlier, consideration and use of vetted publicly available measures. Again, we're not wanting people to reinvent the wheel. If there's measures out there that fit nicely into the core set, we're happy to see those. Also includes milestone workshops engaging key stakeholders and milestone work products made publicly available. And we'll touch on that in just a minute or two. And so this grant program uses the U-type grant mechanism. And that means that this grant is a collaborative effort between the grantee and the funding organization, in this case, the FDA. And this is important because it means that FDA is very much involved. While the grantees are certainly doing the heavy lifting, FDA is very much involved in the development of these core sets, so that the goal is at the end that we stand behind them and kind of encourage their use as part of incorporation into clinical trials. And so as part of that FDA involvement, we hold approximate meetings basically every month with the grantees and kind of work together to ensure that we're going in the right direction, and that we understand how these measures are being developed, or how the core sets are being developed. And the grants are structured so that they include two phases, the planning phase and the implementation phase. The planning phase can last from 1 to 2 years and includes kind of that baseline information, the literature reviews, some of the qualitative work, and then moving into the implementation phase, the UH3 phase, which provides funding for 2 to 3 years for projects to really kind of move the core sets into reality. And we also designed into the grant multiple opportunities for stakeholder input. And so we hold public meetings, which provide an opportunity for stakeholders to ask questions and provide feedback, both as part of the meeting or by submitting feedback to the public docket. Each grantee has also put together an external technical advisory committee made up of disease-specific experts, clinical outcome assessment experts, biostatisticians, patient experts, and other technical experts as appropriate who oversee and monitor specific projects. And these experts come from across the community, including industry, academia, patient advocacy, and of course, regulators. And finally, I do want to kind of touch on the one part of the grant program that I think is really unusual. And that is that we realize that many trials are multi-regional and are used by multiple health authorities to make decisions. And so we've convened a scientific policy board to bring a global perspective to the standard core clinical outcome assessment development process. And this group reviews the grant milestones and provides feedback. And they usually meet in conjunction with our public meetings. The board is currently made up of representatives from FDA, NIH, AHRQ, CMS, the Veterans Administration, MHLW, PMDA in Japan, EMA in Europe, and we are talking to Health Canada as well. And we do anticipate that this will continue to expand and hopefully will help to address some of the challenges that we're seeing in the development of core outcome sets, particularly at a global level. And so in mid-September of 2019, FDA awarded our first 3 grants, and we're working to fund more. And we're very excited to be working with our current grantees and have been incredibly impressed with the strong teams that they've put together. They all have a combination of expertise in clinical areas, clinical outcome assessment methodologies, and a strong commitment to including patient community as they develop the core sets. And there we go. So while time doesn't permit me to talk in depth about all of the projects, the grantees have put together individual websites where they've posted information about their projects and where they will be posting milestone documents that I mentioned earlier. And so here is a link to the Coas site. This is a link to the Clinical Outcome Assessment APTIC site. And here is a link to the NewCode site. And I do want to mention that, as expected, different grantees designed into their grants different timelines. And so while we plan to have these core sets developed within the allotted time frame, all of the grantees are at different points in their developmental process. And so earlier I mentioned that as part of the grant program, we are holding public meetings. And I just wanted to point out that we do have a federal docket that was open for our last public meeting. But because we know that grantees will be posting milestone documents to their websites throughout the grant process, we have chosen to leave the docket open for comments. So that docket remains open and it is checked by us on a regular basis. So if you do have thoughts or comments, please know that the docket is is always available. And so now I would like to turn the microphone back over to Elektra and then to Laura Lee to touch on a few items before we move into the Q&A period.
Thank you, Robyn. So we wanted to just leave you with some helpful resources and the URL links to some of the things that we discussed this morning. And on the next slide, you advance one more. I wanted to also say that the Division of Clinical Outcome Assessment is recruiting talent for the reviewer role, and anyone who is interested, please submit your CV to the mailbox at the bottom of this slide. It's dcoa@fda.hhs.gov, and we will be happy to take a look. And please also feel free to share this information with any interested colleagues. Thank you.
And this is
Laura Lee?
Yes, thank you. I say this is Laura Lee, and I also wanted to add that in the Office of Biostatistics, we are also hiring, and we're hiring statistical reviewers, statistical analysts, team leaders, and supervisors. So if you're interested, you can contact me, or our email for general CV and other hiring information is CDER OTS hires, ends in an S, at fda.hhs.gov. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Laura Lee. To everyone, my name is Michelle Campbell. It's so great to hear everyone. Hopefully we'll get some great questions. So at this time, I would like to ask our panelists to turn on their videos, and we can start our discussion and question and answer period. I do ask, we have 360 participants right now, 352 attendees in this session right now. So that is just an awesome number to see after not seeing everyone for 2 years with this meeting. And so what we're asking for everyone to do is, if you have a question next to your name, you should see a little hand. You want to click on that hand and raise it so we can identify that you have a question. And we'll do our best to come get to you and get your question answered. We will ask you that when we do call and ask you for your question, that you will need to unmute yourself. So some of you may be on double or triple mute. You will need to unmute yourself and wait for 2 beeps, and then ask your question, and then mute yourself. But I'll remind you of that once we get some questions from our audience. So what a great session to hear what's been happening in the FDA in the last 2 years. It's always an exciting time. There's never dull moments, and we always have something going on exciting and new. So I want to start with David. First of all, welcome to FDA, and welcome to being a part of this panel and giving the updates. This is your first panel as being part of the FDA, and that's really great to have you here. So I wanted to start with you with this reorg that's happened, and for a lot of us who've been at FDA, this happened over a couple of years, with the final part of it ending this past March 2020. And now COA is no longer a staff, it's a division, it's in an office, which is new and exciting. With that and all the changes that have occurred under this reorg, what is your vision and future direction you really see now that COA is a division going forward over time with the advancement of science and patient-focused drug development?
David, you're muted, I think.
Yeah, sorry again, double mute. Anyhow, thanks for the question. And as Elektra indicated, I've only been here a short amount of time, but I can make a few comments. I think just to return to the reorganization within OND, we have within Coa the opportunity to focus our collaboration as each team of our reviewers, led by a TL, work for the most part with particular clinical review divisions. And so those collaborations are able to become consistent and deeper over time. We are also working to leverage the digital infrastructure at FDA to support integrated reviews activities between the COA and the review divisions. So to the extent that the growing and modern technology that can facilitate that, that will also reduce unnecessary busy work, increase our efficiency, and bring those teams cross-functionally better together. So that's an important part in some of the work we do in the background. And then, you know, lastly, we are seeing that, and all of you, I assume, are seeing that early initiatives are coming to fruition. The DDT program, the deployment of PROMIS instruments, short forms, et cetera, in drug development programs. And I'm very much looking forward to the output from our standard core COA initiative, which has great potential to impact the critical path, improve our efficiency within the COA, and I suppose in general within the agency. I was certainly impressed when I arrived by the number of tools the COA has built in the last few years to facilitate review, templates, outlines, carefully researched advice that applies for instruments that are commonly used across therapeutic areas. So there's a variety of tools, but we continue to refine that and to grow that so that we can deliver this more collaborative and integrated review that we're growing towards. So I think that's it.
Well, thank you, David. We got a lot of exciting things in this future, and I definitely think having the division and office will help harmonize and making sure that we have a broad base of same approaches happening across all of the therapeutic review divisions in this continuing advancement of patient-focused drug development and the critical need of incorporating the patient voice into our trials and how we collect that data. So with that, I wanted to ask Elektra, now that COA, again, is a division and not a staff, has there really been any changes? I know what my thoughts are on this, but I want to hear from you about has there really been any changes in how, now that COA is a division, how they interact with the other therapeutic review divisions in the Office of Biostatistics as well?
Thank you, Michelle. Well, as you know, we've grown substantially over the past few years, and with this, really, we outgrew the staff model, and so that is why we are now a division. And this is really, I think, in response to the growing demand for patient-focused outcome measures. And so, you know, with that said, at our core, we still work in a highly collaborative manner across all the review disciplines. And so you can think of it almost as like a three-legged stool, because the COA reviewer, the biostatistical reviewer, and the clinical reviewer all need to come together and to make this a success. So I think that there have been quite a few efficiencies gained with the growth of the division now. As David mentioned, we have 3 teams now, and that allows us to have reviewers and our team leaders focused on specific therapeutic areas, both within the qualification arena as well as in the drug development tool arena. And I think that has really helped, with institutional memory and sort of fostering relationships, working relationships between those review teams and their counterparts in the biostatistics review divisions and the clinical review divisions. So I think these have been all really great developments and are very exciting.
It is very exciting. Now, I wonder if we can get a clarification, Elektra. Though the COA group, the division, now the division of COA, DCOA, is a division, is the process still the same, or is there a different process for engagement if a sponsor wants to have one of those type C specific meetings with COA, one of those COA focused meetings? Is the process still the same where they must work through the therapeutic review division, or is there a different pathway?
So the process for requesting a meeting has always, within, let's say within a drug development program, the process for requesting a meeting has always been and still is through the therapeutic area review division. And then once the meeting has been requested, the relevant disciplines, including the COA reviewers and others, will then be invited to participate.
Thank you for that clarification. So I want to encourage our audience out there. Like I said, we have 355 people now. The number keeps on going up and down. And I know you have to have questions. It's been 2 years since we've had an update. And I did see someone had a question. Maybe we've answered it, but do please, I encourage you guys to have this opportunity to ask some questions of what's happening. I want to shift gears for a second, and I want to talk to Laura Lee for a minute. So as we know, the last year has been an unprecedented time with COVID, not just in family life and drug development and vaccine development, but it's also put a big impact in our clinical trials and our protocols and ensuring that we can continue collecting data and continuing our trials, as well as trials trying to start in the middle of a pandemic. And I know that there's been great efforts to make sure that we provide good guidance on how to collect data and what are some key things that we need to make sure we're doing during this time with our data collection and protocol deviations and things like that. And I wonder if you could highlight a little bit more about some of those considerations that should be taken with data collection, handling of missing data, accounting for protocol deviations during this pandemic time.
Sure, I'm happy to discuss that. And I think and thanks to Elektra, Scott Como, and many others who worked on developing guidance in this area as well. So you'll see kind of a combination of both question and answers to some of our standard COVID trial, like how do you basically mitigate issues for trials happening during COVID? But we also have put out various guidances for statistical considerations for those trials. And many sponsors have come to us asking questions. And so we've worked across the Office of Biostatistics and across several different centers as well in order to try to address these questions. So I think a key part to keep in mind is that at the end of the day, we have to pool data, right? So when I have data for a single trial, I need to have all the information for that endpoint in a way that we can actually analyze it. And so it's really important to understand how the data was collected. So if it was collected face-to-face and then you move to remote collection, this is information that as part of the analysis may be really important for us to understand any variations that happen. So understanding how data was collected, where the data was collected, who was doing the assessment, how they were doing it, this is important not only for us to understand short term, but so thinking about this, what may have been a protocol deviation to deal with a quick situation, but also for us to understand 5 to 10 years from now, because a lot of things have happened in the last 15 or so months, and things are continuing to happen. So what's also going to take place is that we will need to think about as data comes in, and sponsors need to think about this as well, to interpret these trials. What is the why for any missingness? So one is data may be there, but what is the context around the data to understand and interpret it? But the second one is when data is not there, why is it not there? Because there are a lot of different ways to try to think about it and to think about the intercurrent event strategies that can be taken as you're trying to do the analyses. And not all missingness is the same. And so as you're doing and updating statistical analysis plans, understanding what are the supplemental analyses that'll help you interpret the trial findings is very important. So this is part, especially also as we see this reuse of data, whether it's in a clinical trial or in registries or other places, it's not just for the single trial that we're concerned, but also for trial planning and the complex designs that may be borrowing this data in future years. So that's one reason to really, it's really critical to account for this as we're trying to plan future trials, but also as you're trying to interpret our current trials. So you'll see a lot of questions coming from the Office of Biostatistics and your clinical offices saying exactly like, how is the data collected? Do we think it's reasonable to try to pool the data together across these different collection methods? And kind of, and why is it missing? And this has been something we've attacked in our discussions with CDISC as well, because many times if there's a missed visit, there's just nothing. And we're like, but we need to know the missingness. We need to better understand that. So you'll have seen a lot of very quick work that's happened. And if you have any questions, do reach out to the review division and ask for a discussion with Office of Biostatistics. And we're happy to try to talk through various ways to address the issues that are coming up. But we would like to get ahead of them instead of dealing with all of them at an NDA or BLA stage.
Yeah, thank you, Laura, for that. I think that's really an important message, is to make sure you're engaging with the therapeutic review division for your product and getting those questions asked if you're going to start making protocol amendments. It is really critical. I know how many I have seen myself and our office has seen, and you know, the respective divisions and biostatistics are there to help really think through some of these questions that you have and try to make sure that we can leverage useful and interpretable data in the end. And as you say, Laura, we've got to pull it together with potentially data that was collected pre-COVID, and how do we do that in the best way? And so we really want to work together to try to find a path forward for this, because we want to be able to use all data that is being collected during this time. So again, I'm encouraging people, please, let's have some questions. I actually see someone who has their hand raised, so I'm going to ask folk if they would like to ask their questions. The host will unmute you. You will hear 2 beeps, and then you'll be able to ask your question.
Hello, this is Folk. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you tell us your name and your affiliation, please?
Yes. So my name is Folke Folkvaljen. My background is in statistics, but I work as a patient-centered science director with AstraZeneca. And my field right now is cardiovascular and renal diseases. So my question is about interpreting the effect on clinical outcome assessments, especially PRO measures, when there is an ongoing pandemic. So personally, I face two situations right now. One where a substantial amount of data is collected prior to the pandemic, however we define that, and another situation where not nearly enough information was collected before the pandemic to be able to have a separate analysis of that. And then what we see, even before unblinding any data sets, is a tendency towards, well, the patients who are randomized during the pandemic, increasingly we see that they present a different patient profile. And then the responses equally are different from the responses on a group level of those randomized and followed up prior to the onset of the pandemic. So what is expected from us in terms of handling that? So we have a lot of ideas, and amongst ourselves, we reach out to experts, we reach out to the stakeholders, to see how they react to our handling of this. But how can we interact with the COA division in terms of deciding how well our proposed solutions fit this problem?
Yeah, thank you, Folk, for that question. I'm not sure who would like to start, either David in the lecture combination or Laura Lee. I feel like there's going to be a blend of an answer between these two offices with that, as you did touch on a couple of themes that impact both of those offices. So I will let one of them start that answer, but thank you for that question.
So this is Laura Lee. I can start and then pass it over to David. And I think an important part that you mentioned, though, is especially when you have double-blind randomized trials, these randomized trials, because at the end of the day, you're looking at comparing the trial arms. And I think that's a very important part. So there is a question of trying to interpret kind of what is meaningful change for patients, what is happening within the patient. But from many of these trial perspectives, I think a lot of it is you're comparing the trial arms. And so here, what is impacting your placebo group or your control group is also impacting that investigational arm. And so if the question is that you think that COVID is differentially impacting them, then there are ways to handle that statistically that we discuss in our statistical considerations guidance. And part of that is looking at interactions and a variety of other methods. So it is a discussion to have a pre-discussion with. And I think the point that you bring up about kind of the different subsets of patients, how many people you'll have in that, and if you're going to be able to evaluate there reasonably is, and these are questions that we're discussing internally as well. But Elektra, I don't know if you wanted to add anything more to this.
I'll just say a few words. So early in the pandemic, we did get a lot of questions from sponsors on this topic. And so if you do have questions specific to your program, please go through the therapeutic area review division with those questions. And of course, you can request a meeting or you can ask for another interaction. And I think, so one of the first things to consider is, of course, feasibility. When you have an assessment that is, say, profoundly impacted by, say, stay-at-home orders, this really, it necessitates going through the say you have a PRO, it necessitates kind of looking at each item on that PRO to sort of see how a stay-at-home order might impact the patient's ability to respond. And so this is a type of exercise that we did quite early in the pandemic with different COAs. Some COAs are accessible remotely, others are not. And so you really have to look at the feasibility first and foremost when you're making these important decisions. In some cases, if you have a COA that has multiple components and you found that you can only assess a subgroup of those components, then that might be something to talk about with the review division as well. So it's a very complex question, but hopefully, we've given you a few things to think about.
Thank you very much. So that's a very, very informative answer. And you touched on exactly the type of issue we're facing, where it doesn't mean the entire, so it is mainly the stay-at-home order. It's not the diagnosis of COVID itself. It's the restrictions placed on patients that's, as far as we can tell, limiting their ability to experience daily life as they would before, and therefore assess the impact of their disease symptoms on their daily life. So I understand that we can look at, how individual items are affected rather than throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, for entire scores. That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for that question, folks. That was a really great question. Did you have a follow-up?
Hi, no, it was just David. I was going to add a thought if we have a minute.
Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that it may be important whether the changes you're seeing in your patient population are directly related to your concept of interest, or whether you view those as a nuisance variable that's perhaps just degrading the signal as you measure your concept of interest. So that will probably change how you approach it. And if it's a nuisance variable, there are obviously some methodological approaches that I'm sure Laura Lee would be happy to discuss with you, because they're relatively complex. But if it's actually related to the concept of interest and you interpret that as a change in your patient population, it might be worth considering whether you need in some way to assess the current study population, which may have shifted from the population you studied in preparation for your COA assessment. And that population is probably not static. So during your trial, either within your trial or in parallel to your trial, if you have content-related questions, it might be an opportunity to do some supportive research.
That's a very good point. And although we hope they're nuisance variables, when there are signals that, you know, the patient population being enrolled or being randomized is actually changing, and as you said, not in a static way, there isn't an on-off switch, because, you know, we have international trials and different countries are employing restrictions very differently. So yeah, we would reach out to both the Biostat division and the COA division for help with this. Thank you.
And I would add that when you do those reach outs, it's very useful to understand kind of what the patient mix is at the time, and very detailed questions. So like, you know, if it's by region, et cetera, because it helps us think about what are and are not feasible solutions to start discussing with you.
Of course, yes, thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. And actually, I wish I could see this person in person right now. I'm going to call them out, and maybe they will say comment on what I'm about to mention. So I'm calling out RJ Worth right now. But it has to do actually with a little bit of what that discussion was on about what happened in the trial. But, you know, in this core standard grant for migraine, we were in the early midst of providing advice during the beginning of a pandemic on migraine at the beginning, when we needed to take into account qualitative work. And, you know, there was a concern of how the pandemic was impacting the patients' lives, and were we going to be actually capturing their lived experience qualitatively, which was the foundational work we needed to be able to move through this grant. And RJ is the PI of that grant and has done they did some really great work. And I don't know, RJ, if you want to, if they can unmute you and you want to comment on what you did and what you found, because there were some really great findings that you guys came and talked to us about in that of lessons from that community that really did help. And this just shows another reason why it's always good to come have these conversations with the agency right now when you're development. And this is an example of we're not even in the middle of a trial where we're just trying to start PRO development of something. So RJ, if they've unmuted you and you would like to comment on that, I would appreciate it.
They did unmute me, whether I wanted to be or not. I don't know if you can hear me okay. I don't have my mic set up appropriately, so hopefully you can hear me. But yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges walking into the Coas project is that it started right, well, it was with all these projects, right? It started up right before the pandemic hit. So we're already through writing up a protocol and interview guide, and then sort of how to take a step back and rethink everything we were doing and how the pandemic was going to, you know, impact that. But we had some wonderful conversations with FDA, and we're able to integrate, luckily, a whole section of our initial qualitative work around COVID and how that impacted people with migraine, and whether or not they were able to differentiate their life sort of pre-pandemic and mid-pandemic. And I think what we found, at least within people living with migraine, is that they were, you know, quite able to sort of, you know, they've lived with this for so long that they really understood what life was like coming into the pandemic, and then how the change in the world was impacting, you know, having to live with migraine. And interestingly, in some ways, it was positive. Not that the pandemic in any way is positive, but a lot of the social anxiety and a lot of the other issues that people living with migraine face went away when you didn't have to be out in public and didn't have to interact with people. So it's been a really informative and very interesting conversation with people, and hopefully we'll be able to dive into that a little bit more and put out a broader picture of how people have been dealing with it. But I think it was actually a really useful process to go through. It was really enlightening, really informative to us. And it was really interesting to see that people were able to compartmentalize, sort of COVID and the impacts of COVID and the impact of things just being shut down and what their life is generally. And it seems like they're able to do that quite nicely, at least within the migraine space. Obviously, other diseases would be impacted differently.
Well, first of all, thank you, RJ, for letting me call on you virtually and for responding. But I think we also found that results very supportive, and we learned also from what the patient said that they were able to do that. And so we also appreciate taking that time. You're right. You had written a protocol, we had given advice, and then we were rewriting a protocol in a way to capture and reflect that. So thank you, RJ, for sharing that experience to everyone. And I think, again, it was just another example of showing, one, why to come talk to us, but two, how being thoughtful right now in all aspects of protocol development, COA implementation, trying to right now develop maybe a de novo instrument, or at least try to develop content validity on anything of a concept area to actual what's happening in a trial. There are a lot of things to consider, and that we are here to help think those through with you during this time. So I want to shift gears a little bit. We've talked about COVID for some time now, and I want to ask Elektra a question because part of what PRO Consortium's mission to do is to develop COAs or PROs, now they've expanded COAs, through the Qualification Program to support areas of unmet need. And so we're about 4 years in now of 21st century, and the new process changes that have happened. And you did a great job of kind of highlighting how we have a new process, final process guidance that's out that was, laid out in law, but really how we had to operationalize it in the content outlines. But, this was an interesting transition time for, I think, both us working on the FDA side and for our submitters as well. Do you have any thoughts or lessons learned or things just from the last 4 years that reflecting back of when we had to make those really procedural changes to the program that was pretty up and running and was really working well for us on the COA front, and really now we had to make some changes, and I think they've been beneficial changes in my opinion. But do you have any lessons learned you'd want to speak about to the audience from reflecting on the last couple of years with 21st Century?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest lesson was, just the high degree of commitment required among all parties that is really needed for this to be successful. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've had success with the consortium model, and the PRO Consortium has had a number of successful qualifications now. So, and with the new process, we have a lot more sort of structure. We have the milestones, submissions, the submission milestones, and as well as the review clocks that I think make it more sort of transparent to external stakeholders, sort of the time commitment that is involved. And, none of this has really changed the basic evidence that is needed for a successful qualification. But I think it has really put some helpful structure in place. And as you noted, we have some resources also in place, like the content outlines for each of the milestone submissions. the other important thing I think that is helpful is with the transparency provisions, people can go and look at both the submissions as well as the FDA responses to those submissions and take away some important lessons learned that they can also apply to their projects. Now, I do want to take just a moment to say that, it's very important to know that qualification is regulatory qualification is not required for COAs to be successfully used in drug development or regulatory decisions, and never was. And I just wanted to mention this because it has been a misconception, and I think we need to work hard to dispel that misconception. Thank you.
Thank you, Elektra, with that. So I'm going to say last call for any questions that the audience may have, but I am going to ask a final question to Robyn so she doesn't feel completely left out. And I think to cover, what we've been covering today, we've been hitting some different topic areas. And I wanted to ask you a question about the standard core grants. And before I say the question, I want to acknowledge that we do have a hand up, and we'll get to that question momentarily. And so Robyn, with the standard core set, we really, the first round is a pilot, and there was a second RFA that went out. How do we as FDA anticipate that the grantees, the awardees of the funding, will manage future requests for use of these identified core sets that have been developed, and its anticipation of transfer of management and permissions and access, the scoring parts, would occur after the project is over, and how we're really, I guess, maintaining a COA. I think all of us here would say that, part of good COA development is always the maintenance piece, right? Once you get it developed and it works, you need to make sure it still works and have to do fine tuning and just checking to make sure we're still measuring the appropriate thing. So what is really that expectation, I guess, post-grant life of a developed core core standards COA that we have funded?
So great question, and I think that it is a really important point. So thanks, Michelle, for bringing it up. And I think we did try to kind of address that within the funding opportunity announcement. And really, some of the milestone documents include a maintenance plan or a life cycle management plan, where we want the grantees to demonstrate the ability to perform appropriate maintenance and life cycle activities to ensure the course set development reflects the current state of the science and the patient community needs beyond just the grants period. And so we do ask for that plan, and we do anticipate when we talk about the making these core sets available free of charge or at a nominal fee. I think we're kind of thinking maybe that nominal fee would be potentially in some ways to kind of support this ongoing effort. If the applicants or if the grantees anticipate transferring the management and maintenance of the core set to other organizations after the grant period, and they outline that as part of their plan, they just really need to provide a supportive case for their proposed approach. But it's really just hoping that we think this through so that it does live beyond the grant period, because I mean, this is important work, and we want it to last. So thank you.
All right. No, thank you, Robyn, for that. So we have one question, and this will be our last question for this session. And so I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. Jansen, if you would like to state who you are and your affiliation, and the host will unmute you.
Hi, thank you. This is Yanfen Guan from Merck. And I just have a question about the PFDD guidances. I was wondering if there's an estimated timeline for finalization of guidances 2 to 4.
Well, thank you for that question. And I will defer to any member on this panel of who would like to speak with that.
So I'll take a first stab at this, just because it's being coordinated out of the Office of the Center Director, out of my office, Patient-Focused Drug Development. And I will say that we are working very hard on these guidance documents and working very hard to get them out. As you can see from some of the guidances that Elektra pointed to earlier today, and Laura Lee talked to about all of the protocol changes, some of our staff during COVID have kind of had to shift a little bit of their focus to kind of more very time-sensitive issues, but we are very much working to get those out. We don't have a specific timeline in place yet, but please know that every effort is being made, and people are meeting regularly and working on these documents and putting a lot of work into the documents. I don't know if any of my colleagues who are also putting a lot of work into the documents would like to say anything else, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, and I can add to that. And I know for David, Elektra's, and our staff in the Office of Biostatistics and our clinical colleagues that we work with, and our staffs in the other centers, because these are guidances that go across multiple other centers. We've had to reassign some of our key employees at times to work 100% on COVID-19 efforts. And we've had to produce a lot of extra guidances, which take a lot of time, and their updates take a lot of time. And we have, just a tremendous amount of work that has come in, and a lot of impacts on our staff's lives as well. So we are making every effort that we can, because we too want these guidances done. But there's only so many hours in the day that people can work. And this is between this and hiring efforts, like, this is a huge issue and a huge lift. So we will get them out as soon as we can. And we're all working very hard for that. But we've focused on the pandemic when we needed to, and we are, though, working very hard to try to get these done.
Yeah, thank you, Laura Lee and Robyn, for that answer. So I want to thank my panelists, Elektra, David, Robyn, and Laura Lee, for a great session and presentation on an update of what's happened in the last 2 years at FDA. And I want to thank those who've answered questions, and thank you, RJ, for letting me call you out and helping guide this conversation today. Just want to let you guys know that we are going to take a break now. It is a 20-minute break. It will end at 12:50. We will start our next session this afternoon, entitled Migraine, the Tale of Two Paths to PRO-Based Product Labeling. I actually think it's going to be a really exciting session, and really I think what everyone asks for in these meetings is we want to see an example of something getting into a label, and well, here you go, we have an example. I also want to remind you, T has asked me, please do not log out. The meeting will stay running during the next 20 minutes on break. So remute your lines if they're not already muted.